Stevenson. I'm off camera, but I'm David Stevenson. I'm on camera. Hi. And we're back to do another show with Mike Toto and Mike Zachea, both veterans. And we've been talking a lot about some of the issues that face veterans coming back from wars like Iraq and Afghanistan and some of the other wars in America's history. But now we're going to talk a little bit about more the price of war, the cost of war for civilians. And we could talk about the Civil War, where it was a self-contained war in America, where civilians bore, as they always do, it seems, the brunt of they're defenseless.
Yes, and my name is Mike Zachea. I'm a retired Marine Lieutenant Colonel. I was wounded in the Second Battle of Fallujah in Iraq, and I'm wearing dark glasses because I have a traumatic brain injury. And you're right. Unfortunately, civilians are always the one who suffers the most as a result of wars, both for the population in Iraq and for the families and friends and whatnot of veterans coming home. There's always collateral damage, both physically and emotionally, unfortunately.
Yeah. And that is something that is very rarely talked about.
Yes. Well, when you look at Iraq, and this is the war that I'm most familiar with, this decade of war in Iraq, we've essentially broken Iraq. Colin Powell famously said, if you break it, you own it.
What became to be known as the Pottery Barn Rule, but that's not how he said it. But we like to put things into corporate terms.
I talk to Iraqis. I have Iraqi friends, and they tell me that the effects that this war has had on their society is worse than the effects of the Iran-Iraq War.
Wow!
In the Iran-Iraq War, 1980 to 1988, something on the order of 400,000 Iraqis were killed in combat in 8 years.
Wow.
Estimates. There are a number of estimates about the effects of this war on Iraq, but estimates run from anywhere from 200,000 to 600,000 killed in a decade. And the other part of it is the effect that we've had on the infrastructure of Iraq. We've broken the water supply. We've broken the electrical supply. The electrical supply was never great, but now it doesn't work. Most metrics of Iraq as society is worse off now.
It was a very cultured, very, very highly skilled, very highly educated society when we arrived. Granted, they had a dictator.
Right.
But in terms of culture, in terms of
education,
in terms of being a kind of a Western-style country.
They were also the ones who were known as one of the best engineers in the world.
Well, this is
coming from an architect. Certainly would be aware of that.
This is a really important point because there was a time when Baghdad was, and even under Saddam Hussein, Baghdad was one of the world's international cities, one of the great cities in the world that had that had a thriving Jewish population and a thriving Christian population, and everybody. It was a multicultural society. Everybody lived there harmoniously. It was a prosperous nation. They had the war, and then
things kind of fall apart when you have a war.
Well, there was,
but they had a common enemy.
Right.
That was the difference.
Which was Iran.
Which was Iran.
Yeah.
But
and
now
kind of
they have sectional.
Right. At one point, Iraq had the highest literacy rate in the Arab world.
That's right.
And they're very, very well educated, very capable.
Yes.
They had a solid middle class. It was a right-wing socialist country. So everything, especially during the Iran-Iraq War. So things started getting rationed, and there were vouchers and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But when things really started to fall apart for Iraq was when Iraq invaded Kuwait based on a misunderstanding with
the United States.
Yes. And here's what people don't know about this is that when the first President Bush was the director of the CIA, he made Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein had been a low-level smuggler. They're called smugglers. We think of smugglers as criminals, but then in that culture, they're really like import-exporters.
An importer-exporter, okay.
Right. And he got involved with the Ba'ath Party, and but he got developed as a CIA asset when the first Bush was the director of the CIA. And then they engineered the coup in '73, and then Saddam Hussein went from being vice president to being president.
Sounds like the genesis of that famous photo of Saddam Hussein and Don Rumsfeld shaking hands.
Well, I will tell you a story. When I was in Iraq, I was at the Green Zone. We were there in April, and this is when everything had exploded. The insurgency had exploded across the country. And I got approached by a guy who worked in Bremer's office. He was an Air Force colonel, and he interviewed me.
The so-called mayor of Baghdad?
Yeah,
the head of
This was a U.S. guy or an Iraqi? Was a U.S.?
Air Force lieutenant, Air Force colonel who worked for Bremer in their Office of Military Operations. And he interviewed me, and he told me that the best tour of his career, he had been an advisor on the ground for Iraqi forces during the Iran-Iraq War. As advising the Iraqi.
And of course, Iraq was our ally during the Iraq-Iran War. We chose up sides with Iraq against Iran.
Of course,
Iran being in our government's eyes the bigger danger.
Right, and he, he was an Air Force guy, but he helped advise the Iraqi Air Force to target Iranian troops and all that kind of stuff. So there was a time really when the United States and Iraq were actually not just allies, but really very worked together.
Tight allies, very tight allies.
And really, the population, the education, that's the way it really should have been. It should have stayed that way. But at some point, strategically, the first President Bush decided that, we created this guy, now we're going to uncreate him or destroy him.
Yes.
And there could have been a whole alternative history of American-Iraqi relations.
I've heard that the Bush administration, that's the first Bush administration, basically told Saddam Hussein, go ahead, take Kuwait. You can have it. And then turn around as soon as he took it.
I don't think they overtly said that, but what they did do was to basically turn a blind eye. He had made comments or things to Kuwait saying that, hey, you are part of Iraq, we want you back and everything else. And he went on and on and on, and we did nothing about it. And that was the thing that started it.
My understanding is that he thought, and he may have been told this, that there was a tacit understanding that as a reward for what he sacrificed against Iran, he would
get a Kuwait?
Yes.
Wow.
And they have a historical claim because historically Kuwait had been part of Iraq.
Yes.
And there was also this business about Kuwait was taking oil from, there was that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So he, from his point of view, he thought he had a claim. He thought he had cause.
And the blessing of the U.S.
Right. And 13 years later, he is saying, what the heck happened?
Yeah.
How come they're turning on me? I don't. And he never ever thought. Everything I've read, and at one point I'd read just about every book that was written about this. He never understood or thought that they would actually remove him.
Is that right?
Yes.
Wow.
And because here's what the Iraqi officers told me is that they always believed that he had weapons of mass destruction.
They believed it.
Yes. And they believed that what he was going to do was lure the Americans into Baghdad and then bring weapons of mass destruction onto them in like chemical munitions in Baghdad, in the city proper.
If I didn't want you to invade me, you know what I would tell you? I've got weapons of mass destruction. I've got chemical weapons.
Of course.
So yeah, come on, invade me.
Well, the other thing
in order to dissuade them from invading.
He needed to pose a threat to Iran as well.
Yeah.
I mean, otherwise, they just run over him.
Right. So he, but 14 years later, 14 years later, he's sitting there saying, "What the heck happened? How did this?
It all fell apart."
Yeah, and our American society and Iraqi society should have been very, very close. I mean, multicultural society, very open, very learned. There should have been, a lot of cultural exchange, a lot of, back and forth. It could have been great allies. But at some point in time, for whatever reason, probably because the first Bush was much more close to the Saudi family. He
Yes.
threw his lot in with the Saudis rather than the Iraqis. And he said, we built this guy up, now we're going to bring him down.
Yeah, we know. And we know the Bushes have strong ties. The whole Bush family has strong ties to the Saudis.
There was a little thing about oil also that's mixed in with
Yeah,
that
a little
too.
bit about oil, sure.
10 years now into the war, 8 years into the war, 8+ years, Iraqi society has been, basically destroyed. Anywhere from 200,000 to 600,000 have been killed. But more importantly, there's been a brain drain. Anybody who could get out has gotten out.
Yeah.
And
2 million across the border into Syria and Jordan.
Broken into sectarian strife.
5 million total refugees. It's the largest refugee crisis in the world right now.
5 million people left Iraq
Yes.
because of the war.
Internal or external.
Yeah.
But nobody talks about the fact that this is the largest refugee crisis in the world right now,
Without any expectations
Right.
of solving it.
Yes, the water system. People don't talk about the water system. There are terrible cholera epidemics because the water system, which has worked for more than 4,000 years, no longer works, and they can't get clean water.
They've got two marvelous rivers that run through that city.
Well, I don't know if they're actually they're pretty
Historically speaking, it's the cradle of civilization.
Yes.
No longer, I guess.
It's really been reduced to
Open sewers.
And if you know Iraq history, and if you even modern Iraq history,
Yes.
and you can see what should have been versus what is now, the Iraqi people have really suffered. 20% of the population has been displaced. Hundreds of thousands have been killed. Hundreds of thousands, more than that, have been wounded. And there's also, they've been traumatized. There's such a thing. They themselves suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. I know Iraqis that I served with in combat who, are traumatized. They have the same symptoms. So it's not an American phenomenon. It's a sort of a human
What
condition.
happens to them?
The same thing,
I meant treatment-wise. Do they
Oh,
get
nothing.
Nothing.
No. Yeah, there's no
They just
treatment.
live with it.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, there's, they don't have the same sort of opportunities and medical resources that...
What do you see for Iraq 10 years down the road?
The game now is to get out with as much money as possible. Exploit the resource and get out. If you can get money, you get out. It's really...
It's going to become a basket case.
I think it is difficult. And everybody thinks that we won the war. We haven't won the war. My understanding, and what I learned in the Marine Corps, for winning the war is destroying the enemy's will to fight. And if you follow the Iraqi news, the enemy's will to fight has not been destroyed. They are still fighting. They still want to fight. It's not better off now than it was when we
started.
invaded. You can say we got rid of Saddam Hussein, and that was a good thing because he was, you can make a definite argument that there was a humanitarian reason. But, if you make that argument, then, what do you do with the way Iraq is now in the refugee
What
crisis?
did you replace him?
Right. So, to your original point, the suffering of the civilians in Iraq has been really Iraqi society has been profoundly altered.
Devastated.
And, yes.
So out of post 9/11 American politics, we have this invasion of Iraq, and let's start with with shock and awe. What did that do to Baghdad?
I've actually read both the original book by Harlan Ullman, and I know where it came from. Milton Friedman. It's actually an economic prescription for jump-starting a capitalist, libertarian capitalist economy.
Yeah, laissez-faire capitalism.
Yes.
Chile, perfect. Yes.
Right, the book by Naomi Klein. And reading that book, I had not understood a lot of things when I was there that I saw, and suddenly when I read that book, I understood things that I experienced.
Bremer was the perfect?
Yes, that did not make sense to me.
The tool.
Right. And including the torture policy, because torture always goes along with, the shock and awe doctrine, both militarily and economically.
In what way?
They eliminate,
breakdown of society.
anybody who might object to their economic agenda. They torture them and disappear them.
So it wasn't by happenstance that Abu Ghraib happened.
I don't think so. I absolutely don't think so.
It wasn't just a bunch of wild kids out on the weekend. Kids out on the weekend saying, "Hey, let's stack these guys up and take pictures of them nude."
You
and
can always get the bottom guys.
Right.
You get those, always.
Right.
But
And that was
They
a big
said they
deal
were
for
following
us.
orders. Were they?
That was a big
Sure.
deal for us because at the time we were training our Iraqi army battalion, and on the one hand, where torture was in Iraqi society, it's a brutal society historically. The Iraqi army was a brutal institution historically. So we're trying to teach them all this new stuff about the law of war and how to treat enemy prisoners of war and things like that. And then suddenly you have Abu Ghraib break, and they're all offended, and they want to know, well, you're teaching us this, but this is what you're doing. And it became very, very difficult, and that was something that directly affected our mission ability.
So a double standard of behavior for the soldiers.
Yes.
This is what you're supposed to do. Oh, but by the way, wink, wink.
Right.
This is what we want you to do.
Right. And there was a lot of things going on, but I think that was the first time that Iraqis ever really looked at Americans differently and said, those guys aren't so great. I think that was a very, very underestimated episode.
Yeah.
Historically,
they like many people throughout the world, cherished.
What's amazing
the
to me
American
about that
culture.
is that the general, the Philippine, was he a Philippine
Yes,
American
you're right.
general?
Tagubo, I think it was. Yeah.
Taguba made a report, and he disappeared after that. He obviously blamed
One of the ones,
whole
one of the generals that were retired suddenly.
Yes, he was retired, and his name was sort of persona non grata for I don't know. You never hear about him anymore.
Right.
Anyway.
So, a number of those policies directly affected us. We talk about shock and awe. Bremer went there in May of 2003 with a specific agenda. And he made 4 decisions that really created the Iraqi insurgency. And it was in June of 2003 that the first bombing happened. But infamously, it's well known, dismantling the army, and that's where I came in.
Dismantling the Iraqi army rather than transiting them from one leader to another leader.
Right, and that's
which
where
should have been pretty easy to do.
Did you realize it was a mistake as soon as he said it?
Yes, that
it was so obvious.
I thought that, and then the other parts are they did not secure the military bases.
Yep.
So military bases are completely open, and it was just a free-for-all. The other 2 things that he did were economic. The first thing was that Iraq had 249 state-owned factories that were run by 150 state-owned companies. And he fired all those workers.
All Baathists?
Yes, and he fired everybody. And nobody was in Iraq had been a closed society. They didn't import stuff, so nobody was making anything anymore. And all those people who had, all the people in the army and all the people who had been in manufacturing suddenly were out of work. And then the next thing he did was he let the Iraqi dinar float on the international market. So it had been pegged by Saddam Hussein at 3 dinar to $1. Suddenly, when Bremer came in, with a stroke of his pen, it goes to 1,800 dinar per dollar. So
destroyed the currency.
Yeah, basically,
or the wealth of the nation. Is really
that's
what
kind of what, that's kind of what, in a sense, what Saddam was looking to do. By Iraqi oil was pegged to the dollar.
Yes,
that was the currency for oil. And one of the things, presumably, that got Saddam Hussein in a lot of trouble and put a bullseye on him was he wanted to shift from the dollar to the euro.
Yes.
Because the euro was at that point becoming a stronger currency than the dollar, and he wanted to peg Iraqi oil to the euro, which
Chavez has said the same thing.
Yeah.
Almost everybody who has oil wants to do that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
But the shock doctrine is perfect.
Yes.
I mean, it goes from all of those things, or you can read the shock doctrine, and it's a prescription.
So, in a matter of
months,
even overnight, you went from, if you had 1,800 dinar in your bank, you could buy $600 worth of goods.
Yep.
Overnight, you could buy $1 worth of
worthless.
goods, and everybody else was out of work. So you had no money, and you had no prospect of getting any money. So
that's how you
what are
breed.
gonna do?
That's how you breed terrorists.
That's how you start an insurgency.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah, that's how you start an insurgency. You take people's livelihoods away from them, you throw them out of work, you make the money that they have, those that have earned money and have money, you turn it into worthless.
The silly, I shouldn't say silly, but the thing that amazes me is that even with this, you would have assumed that there must be at least American troops to back this up or to prevent catastrophe, but there weren't.
Right.
Who was guarding all those munitions?
Well,
Nobody.
That was the point.
There is documented evidence. A number of the books say that American troops were ordered to stand by while all this was happening. They were not given orders to, and they wanted to.
They were watching them loot it.
Yes, they wanted to.
Likewise, of course, Iraq being a 4,000-year-old civilization with a lot of marvelous artifacts.
The museums.
All the museums were looted, and apparently a lot of that ended up being taken to other countries, including the United States.
Destroy the society. That was what it was all about.
Yeah, break them down.
Take away their history, remove their history, and there will be nothing left. So it really, I don't know. People use the word rape loosely, but I tend to think of it.
The rape of Iraq.
Yes, I do.
Yeah, it's a very harsh word to use, but if it applies, perhaps
that crazy time and the time where you were starting to employ Iraq soldiers.
That happened in May and June of 2003. I was boots on the ground in March of 2004.
So about a year.
10 months.
10 months. Okay. And in that 10-month period, or the start of your tour, what was the effect? I shouldn't say what was the effect, but how all of a sudden did you then try to employ these Iraqis? Were they so starved for a job that they wanted?
Yes, they were.
Were they good at what they were doing?
Some were not. A third of the Iraqis that we had been in Saddam's army. A third were Peshmerga from Kurdistan, or from Kurds, and a third had no military experience at all, but were just looking for
a job.
Yeah, they needed to, and some were good, some were bad, some were.
Did they believe in Iraq?
They did. Ultimately, when we graduated the battalion after our initial training, they had, and I have this on video, where they're all like chanting and shouting "Wahed Iraq," which means "One Iraq." So they were actually pretty motivated.
And that's a little change, because Iraq, apparently, with the British kind of shoehorned three countries together, including, as you mentioned, Kurdistan, the northern part of Iraq, which had some very famous wars with Turkey next door.
Peshmerga.
So at the time, they were actually real believers in,
let's try it. Let's try being a loose confederation of states at the least, and a united country at the most.
And our battalion graduated on what they now call Iraqi Independence Day, which is June 30th of 2004. So it was a big deal, because we were the first ones. When to your question, I got there in March. The insurgency had been fairly low intensive during that 10 months, but it really exploded in April of 2004.
They called it a low-grade insurgency.
Right.
Like a low-grade fever.
Yeah, and that was when you had Rumsfeld saying, "Well, we don't know what we don't know," and freedom is messy, and all this stuff.
Yeah.
But it really exploded in April of 2004 with the Blackwater contractors who got massacred in Fallujah.
Apparently, they kind of ran into town with their guns ablazing and acting like
cowboys.
Like cowboys.
They should never have been there. They were out on their own. I've read about that. They were. It was really a crime.
They weren't behaving like soldiers would know how to behave.
No, but they were also put in that position by their management, their Blackwater management, and it was not coordinated tactically with any of the units that were supposed to be doing that. Nobody knew that they were out there. It was just a mess, and really, I believe, criminally negligent of Blackwater to even put those guys in that situation. It was a crime, but President Bush wanted to respond to it like it was a military crisis. The Marine Generals Conway and General Mattis wanted to treat it and resolve it like a crime. And they were working. Right? Yes, they were working with the mayor of Fallujah and like the potentates in Fallujah, the city elders, to bring the people to justice. But President Bush wanted a military solution. He wanted, to subdue this city, which was a difficult city to begin with.
Sure.
Conway and Mattis wanted a diplomatic and legal solution to it, which would have saved a whole bunch of people being killed.
And Americans as well, I'm
yes,
sure.
absolutely.
Odd that the military wanted to take a civilian route to solving the problem, and the civilian leaders wanted to take a military route.
Because they weren't there.
Yeah, they weren't there, and they don't know. They don't understand the use of deadly force. They don't understand how to solve problems. When you have, the saying is, when you have a nail, or when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. You know, the generals on the ground understood the situation. They knew the people. They had relationships with the people, which is how everything in Iraq gets done.
Yeah, you had mentioned earlier about, off camera before we sat down, about you have one cup of tea with an Iraqi family, and you're
if you have your first cup of tea, you're a guest. I'm sorry.
Stranger.
Your first cup of tea, you're a stranger. Your second cup of tea, you're a guest. Your third cup of tea, you're family.
So you bond
Yes.
over the process of sitting down and tea and presumably conversation.
Right, and that's how decisions get made. That's how things get done.
Society.
Yeah, and everything I know
functions.
about Iraq and about Iraqis makes me believe that it would have and could have been resolved
Peacefully.
well,
within reason.
right, yeah. You know, certainly not without having an entire Marine division destroy a city. 6 months later, so that was April 2004. 6 months later, 7 months later, I'm in Fallujah. There are 18,000 buildings in the city. We rubbled 2/3 of them. The Iraqis complained that we were killing their cats and dogs, which we were, but that's because they were disease vectors, because there were so many dead bodies in the streets and in the houses and everything, that the animals were eating the bodies in the streets.
It escalated to the point where you really didn't have much of a choice.
Right. Spreading disease. And, I believe, and I'm going to go out on a limb here, but that the casualties from the battle were much higher, because I saw casualty reports that don't match what the sanitized civilian history of Fallujah say they were.
Okay.
You mean both on their side and our side?
Yes, both sides.
We're going to have to wrap it up there. It's a very somber discussion, but we'll come back and we'll continue and talk about some other aspects of not only the cost of war on our kids, but the cost of war on civilians in the countries that we're involved in, and just the whole process of war, and try to find some logical ways to stay away from future involvements of this nature.
I think a whole part of the discussion is to how we can convince politicians about the true cost of war.
Yes.
That, to me, is the big thing we need to do.
Okay, we're off camera.
Absolutely.
Go ahead. Yeah.
2 weeks ago, a lot of I'm very involved in this stuff. So Brown University, a researcher from Brown and